close your eyes for a second. It's December 17th, 1903. The temperature at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina has dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind off the Atlantic is howling at 27 miles per hour. Two men stand on a strip of frozen sand at Kill Devil Hills, and between them sits a machine that looks like something a very ambitious child built in a garage and forgot to finish. Spruce wood, muslin cloth, bicycle chain, piano wire, a hand-machined aluminum engine the size of a suitcase. The whole thing weighs 605 pounds, and in a few moments, one of these men is going to climb on top of it, lay face down, pull a lever, and the world is going to split in two, into the part that existed before that lever moved and the part that exists after it. There are 5 witnesses on that beach. Just 5. Men from a nearby life-saving station who agreed to come look. Most of them thought the whole thing was a fool's errand. The newspapers had already decided that powered human flight was a fantasy. The scientific community had already moved on. The United States War Department had already spent $50,000 watching the most credentialed aviation researcher in the country dunk his machine into the Potomac River 9 days earlier, and the editorial writers across America had declared the verdict final. Flight was impossible. Physics said so. The math said so. The institutions said so. The 2 men standing on that beach said otherwise. And here is what makes this story unlike anything else in the history of American invention. Those 2 men, the ones about to prove every expert wrong, the ones about to do what $50,000 of government money could not do, the ones about to change the arc of human civilization on a strip of frozen beach with no cameras and no crowd. Those 2 men ran a bicycle repair shop in Dayton, Ohio. They had no engineering degrees, no university backing, no government contract, no investors. Their total combined budget for the entire flight program, from the first kite to the last propeller shaft, was less than $1,000. And I am making you a promise right now, before we go a single second further. By the time this story is over, you are going to understand why that bicycle shop was not a limitation. You are going to understand why it was the single most important advantage those 2 men had. Why everything that made them succeed, every insight, every instinct, every breakthrough, flowed directly from what they learned by building and repairing bicycles. You are going to understand why a man with $50,000 and a team of engineers failed, while 2 brothers with $800 and a machinist named Charlie Taylor changed history forever. That answer is coming. Stay with me. Wilbur Wright was born in 1867. Orville came along in 1871. Their father was a bishop who believed in argument. He would take a side in a dinner table debate just to force his children to push back, to find the flaws in their own reasoning, to think harder. Their mother, Susan Wright, was the mechanical one. She built her own kitchen appliances when the ones she bought didn't work the way she wanted. She repaired toys. She understood structural problems the way some people understand music, intuitively, from the inside out. Orville said later that the most naturally gifted mechanical mind in the Wright family was their mother. She died in 1889, before any of the flying happened. She never saw what her sons built. That is one of the sadder footnotes in this story, and it is worth sitting with. In 1878, Milton Wright came home from a trip and brought a present. It was a small rubber band-powered toy helicopter, based on a French design. Most children would have played with it until it broke. Wilbur and Orville played with it until they understood it. They took it apart. They built copies from paper and bamboo. They built larger copies. The larger ones didn't fly as well, and instead of being discouraged, they wanted to know why. That question, why doesn't the bigger version work as well as the smaller one, is the seed of the entire journey toward Kitty Hawk. It just takes 25 more years to grow. By the early 1890s, the bicycle craze had hit America like a wave. The safety bicycle had replaced the terrifying penny farthing, and suddenly, ordinary people everywhere wanted one. Wilbur and Orville opened the Wright Cycle Company in 1892, and within a few years they weren't just repairing bikes, they were designing and manufacturing their own, the Van Cleve, the St. Clair. Machines built to be ridden hard and fast, and they had to survive that treatment because the Wright brothers' reputation depended on it. They tested everything. Every new design got ridden, deliberately, until it either proved itself or broke, and if it broke, they figured out exactly why, fixed it, and wrote it again. That is not how engineers and universities thought about machines. That is how a bicycle mechanic thinks. Feel it, break it, understand it, fix it, try again. That philosophy is the entire Wright brothers' story in a single sentence. In 1896, the German glider pioneer Otto Lilienthal died in a crash. He had made more than 2,000 controlled glider flights. He was the most experienced aerial experimenter in the world. He died when a sudden gust of wind flipped his glider and he fell from 50 feet. The news hit Wilbur hard, not with fear, with focus. If the most experienced man in the world could die in a glider, then the fundamental problem had not been solved. And Wilbur, sitting in his bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, started to think about what the fundamental problem actually was. He wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, requesting everything they had published on human flight. He devoured all of it. And together with Orville, he formed a conclusion that almost nobody working on the problem at the time had reached. Everyone else was obsessed with lift and power. Everyone wanted an engine strong enough and wings big enough. But getting into the air, Wilbur argued, was not the hard part. Control was the hard part. A flying machine that couldn't be steered, that couldn't be balanced deliberately by the pilot, was not a flying machine at all. It was just an expensive way to fall. Wilbur spent hours watching birds, buzzards specifically. He watched the way a buzzard adjusts to a gust of wind, not by fighting it, not by holding a rigid shape against the pressure, but by twisting. The tip of one wing drops. The tip of the other rises. The bird finds its balance in 3 dimensions, the way a bicycle rider finds balance in 2, constantly, subtly, instinctively. Wilbur looked at that and understood something the credentialed engineers had missed. A flying machine needed to twist. The pilot needed to control the angle of the wingtips independently, to create more lift on one side and less on the other, to find balance in the air the way a cyclist finds balance on the road. He called it wing warping. That single observation, made by a bicycle mechanic watching a buzzard on an afternoon in Ohio, became the foundation of everything that followed. They built kites first, then gliders. They wrote to the United States Weather Bureau asking which locations had the most consistent winds. Kitty Hawk, on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, came back at the top of the list. They went there, lived in a tent, flew their gliders, crashed them, repaired them, modified them, flew them again, and they learned. The glider didn't perform the way their calculations predicted. A lesser man might have concluded the theory was wrong. Wilbur and Orville concluded that the data they were working from was wrong. The aeronautical tables compiled by earlier researchers were simply inaccurate, so they built their own wind tunnel. In the back of their bicycle shop in Dayton, they constructed a wind tunnel from a wooden box and a fan. They machined dozens of small metal airfoil models, each slightly different in shape, and tested each one in the tunnel, measuring lift and drag with instruments they designed themselves. They ran hundreds of tests. They generated their own aeronautical data, more accurate than anything that existed in the scientific literature, from a wooden box and a fan. In a single winter, they knew more about how air moved over a curved surface than almost anyone alive. And then they went back to Kitty Hawk. By 1902, the glider worked. Not just flew, worked. It responded to control inputs the way a bicycle responds to the handlebars. The pilot could steer it, bank it, correct for gusts, find balance in the moving air. They had made more than 1,000 glider flights by this point, more controlled aerial experience than any human beings in history. They understood the air the way they understood the road. They had ridden it until they could read it. All they needed now was an engine. And this is where the story takes a turn that should stop every person who hears it dead in their tracks. Wilbur and Orville wrote to every automobile and engine manufacturer they could find. They needed an engine that weighed no more than 180 pounds and produced at least 8 horsepower. Every manufacturer replied with the same answer: impossible. The lightest engines available were far too heavy. Nobody could build what they needed. Nobody was willing to try. The technology, they were told, simply didn't exist yet. So the Wright brothers did what bicycle mechanics do. They decided to build it themselves. The man who actually built it was named Charles E. Taylor. Charlie Taylor had been running the Wright Cycle Company shop since 1901. He was a machinist, precise, meticulous, skilled in the way that only comes from years of making things with your hands. He had never built a gasoline engine from scratch before in his life. Wilbur and Orville sat down with him, sketched out the specifications, showed him the calculations, and told him what they needed. Then they left him to it and went back to designing the airframe. Charlie Taylor built that engine in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. From nothing to a running engine, in 6 weeks, by a man who had never built an engine before. The block was cast aluminum, not iron, because aluminum was lighter and every ounce mattered. The cylinders were 4 in number, cast as a single unit. There was no carburetor, because available carburetors were too heavy, so Taylor used a gravity-fed fuel delivery system. Gasoline dripping from a small tank into a metal tray where it vaporized and was drawn into the intake stroke. Every component was made by hand, measured by hand, fitted by hand, tested by hand. When the engine first ran, it seized because the bearing surfaces hadn't been machined to tight enough tolerances. Charlie Taylor remachined them. The engine ran again. It produced 12 horsepower and weighed 152 pounds. They had asked for 8 horsepower and 180 pounds. The man building his first engine ever in a bicycle shop in 6 weeks exceeded every specification on the first day it ran. They shipped everything to Kitty Hawk in the fall of 1903. They assembled the machine by hand on the beach, and the first problem appeared almost immediately. The engine vibrations were too severe for the aluminum propeller shafts. The shafts cracked. They packaged them carefully and shipped them back to Charlie Taylor in Dayton. He machined new shafts from solid steel and sent them back. The brothers waited. November passed. December arrived with cold and cutting wind. The replacement shafts came. They assembled everything again. On December 14th, a coin toss decided who would take the first attempt. Wilbur won. He lay down in the head cradle, opened the throttle, and the flyer rolled down the launch rail, and Wilbur overcorrected. The nose pitched up too steeply, the wings stalled, and the machine settled back into the sand after 3.5 seconds. Not a flight, a stall. They repaired the minor damage and waited 3 more days for the wind to steady. December 17th, 1903, Orville's turn. The wind was blowing at 27 miles per hour, temperature at 34 degrees. John T. Daniels from the life-saving station had his hand on the camera shutter. Orville climbed onto the lower wing, settled into the hip cradle, nodded to Wilbur. Wilbur steadied the right wingtip. The engine fired. The propellers turned. The machine rolled down the 60-foot rail they had laid in the frozen sand. Wilbur ran alongside, boots pounding the ground, steadying the wingtip until the machine lifted free. At 10:35 in the morning, the flyer rose off the end of the rail. It climbed. It dipped. It climbed again. It flew, uneven, searching, working through the crosswind, for 120 feet and 12 seconds before settling back to the sand. John T. Daniels pressed the shutter at exactly the right moment and produced what became the most reproduced photograph of the entire 20th century. The flyer rising. Orville face down at the controls. Wilbur standing to the right, one hand still reaching toward the wingtip he'd just released, watching his brother fly. They flew 4 times that morning. The 4th flight covered 852 feet in 59 seconds. Then, a gust of wind caught the machine while it sat on the ground and tumbled it end over end, breaking it beyond repair. They couldn't fly again. But it didn't matter. The machine had already done what it needed to do. That afternoon, they sent a telegram to their father. It read, "Success. 4 flights, Thursday morning. All against 21-mile wind. Started from level with engine power alone. Longest 59 seconds. Inform press. Home Christmas. Orville Wright." They were home for Christmas, and the world had changed. Almost nobody knew it yet. Here is the strangest part of this entire story. After December 17th, the Wright brothers returned to Dayton and continued their work in near total secrecy for 2 more years. They flew a more advanced machine at Huffman Prairie, a cow pasture 8 miles from downtown Dayton, while occasional streetcar passengers peered out the window and wondered what those 2 men were doing in that field. By September of 1905, they had a machine that could fly for 39 minutes in a controlled circle. They could bank, turn, circle a point, and land exactly where they had planned. They had not merely invented powered flight. They had mastered it. And America barely knew they existed. The newspapers were not interested. Scientific American published almost nothing. The War Department wrote back a polite non-response when the brothers offered a demonstration. The world had already decided that powered flight was impossible, and it was not in a hurry to decide otherwise. The Wright brothers waited, worked, and said nothing publicly. They were not in a hurry to be famous. They were in a hurry to be right. And they were, so completely, so profoundly right that the world eventually had no choice but to catch up. When Wilbur flew in France in 1908, he took a crowd of European aviation enthusiasts who had come prepared to be skeptical and turned them into believers on the first pass. He banked into a clean, controlled turn that put the entire machine on its side, circled the field at 30 feet, and landed exactly where he had started. A French pilot who watched the flight said afterward, "We are as children compared to the Wrights." A French journalist wrote that every man who watched Wilbur fly understood immediately that the world had changed and that the change could never be undone. Now let us talk about what 2 bicycle mechanics actually gave the country. The 12-horsepower engine that Charlie Taylor built in 6 weeks powered the first 59 seconds of controlled human flight. But what it really powered was a century. In World War I, military aircraft changed the nature of combat forever. In World War II, American air power was decisive. The B-17 flying fortresses that bombed industrial Germany, the P-51 Mustangs that escorted them across Europe, the naval aircraft that turned the Pacific War at Coral Sea and Midway, the transcontinental airlines that connected a continent and made America into a single functioning nation, the Apollo program that put men on the moon. Every American aircraft that ever flew, from the Flyer to the F-22, carries the intellectual DNA of two men who never finished high school and fixed bicycles for a living in Dayton, Ohio. Wilbur Wright died in 1912 at the age of 45 of typhoid fever. He never saw most of what his work made possible. Orville lived until 1948, long enough to see the jets arrive, long enough to know that Chuck Yeager had broken the sound barrier, long enough to see the world of aviation that his first 59 seconds in the air had eventually built. He gave very few interviews in his later years. He was a private man, uncomfortable with fame. He had been after the machine, not the recognition. He got the machine on December 17, 1903, and everything that followed was, in some sense, aftermath. Charlie Taylor is almost never mentioned when people tell this story. He worked for the Wright Company when it became a real business. He later worked for Henry Ford. He died in 1956 in Los Angeles in poverty after years of illness, and it was only through a friend's intervention that he received a proper burial. The man who built the engine that changed the world died poor and largely forgotten in a city that had no idea what he had made in a bicycle shop in Dayton half a century earlier. History is not always just. Sometimes the people who make the most important things are the last ones the world remembers. Now here is the promise I made you at the beginning, the reason why the bicycle shop was the most important advantage those two men had. Samuel Pierpont Langley had $50,000 from the War Department, a team of trained engineers, and the full institutional weight of the Smithsonian behind him. His machine sank in the Potomac River 9 days before Kitty Hawk. How? How is that possible? The answer is the bicycle shop. Here is what a bicycle mechanic knows that an engineer often doesn't. A machine is never finished when you're done designing it. A machine is only finished after you've ridden it 1,000 times in every kind of condition and fixed every single thing that broke and understood at the level of instinct, not calculation, exactly what it does and why. Langley built machines from theory and sent them off launchers and watched them sink. The Wright brothers built gliders and flew them themselves. They felt every gust through the control cables. They felt every moment when the machine began to lose balance. They felt the difference between a recovery and a crash with their own bodies. They crashed in the sand over and over and walked away and fixed the machine and flew again. More than 1,000 glider flights before they ever put an engine on anything. Because that is what you do when you are a bicycle mechanic. You ride the machine, you feel it, you break it. You understand it in a way that no calculation and no university can ever substitute for. And you know it, not theoretically. Actually, that knowing is not something you can buy with a government grant. You cannot credential your way to it. You cannot engineer it from behind a desk. You can only get it by doing, by failing, by getting back up and trying again with the knowledge of exactly why you failed. The Wright brothers did that 1,000 times in the sand dunes at Kill Devil Hills. Langley never did it at all. He trusted the calculations. The Wright brothers built from calculations, then went out and found where the calculations were wrong and fixed them, and went back and found where they were still wrong and fixed them again. That is the difference. That is the whole difference. That is everything. The world has always had a habit of trusting the credentialed over the curious, the funded over the determined, the institution over the individual. It has always assumed that the man with the degree knows more than the man with the tools. The Wright brothers destroyed that assumption so completely, so publicly, so permanently, that it should never have needed to be destroyed again. But it does. It needs to be destroyed again constantly, because the assumption always comes back. The world keeps looking at the man in the bicycle shop and deciding he can't possibly understand the deep problems. And the man in the bicycle shop keeps proving the world wrong, if he is stubborn enough and honest enough and willing to fail often enough to learn from every failure. Wilbur Wright wrote a letter to a friend in 1900, near the very beginning of the flight work. He wrote, "For some years I have been afflicted with the belief that flight is possible to man. My disease has increased in severity, and I feel that it will soon cost me a considerable sum of money and a good deal of time." He called it a disease. He was joking, but he was also telling the truth. He meant that he could not let it go, that the problem had gotten into him and refused to leave, The way a real problem gets into a man and reorganizes everything around itself until it is solved. That is what obsession looks like when it is the genuine article, not excitement, not ambition, a disease, something you did not choose, cannot cure, and would not trade for anything. The flyer is in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington today. You can go stand underneath it in the main gallery, right next to the Apollo 11 command module. It hangs from the ceiling, and it looks impossibly fragile for a thing that changed everything. This muslin and spruce machine with its bicycle chain and its hand-machined aluminum engine, looking like something you could break with one hand. It flew 120 feet in 12 seconds on its first flight, and 852 feet in 59 seconds on its fourth. And those numbers divided all of human history into the part before and the part after. The 12-horsepower engine that Charlie Taylor built in 6 weeks powered the first 59 seconds of human flight. What it really powered was a century of American dominance in the air, a century of aviation that transformed commerce and war and exploration, and the entire shape of life on this planet. The engine that powered a nation was built by a man who had never built an engine before, on specification from 2 men who repaired bicycles for a living, in a shop in Dayton, Ohio, in 6 weeks, for a total cost that is almost insultingly small when you consider what it produced. That is who we were. That is what this country made when it was at its best. Not the most credentialed people, not the most funded, the most determined, the most willing to fail honestly, and learn from every failure, and get back up and try again. 2 bicycle mechanics, a machinist who had never built an engine, an $800 budget, the frozen beach at Kill Devil Hills, and 59 seconds that changed everything. Now, I want to hear from you. Who in your mind belongs in the same conversation as the Wright brothers? Not the funded scientists, not the engineers with the government grants, but the ones who built something world-changing from almost nothing with their hands because they refused to stop until the machine worked? Tell me in the comments, because the people who built this country are worth knowing by name.